Louisa, and I'm it's a great honor to be here. I think I spent one evening at Pepperdine once at the home of Professor Batchelor many years ago, but I used to drive by it, and always there was this beautiful place on top of the mountain, and now I get to visit the top of the mountain. It's great. But I've greatly appreciated over the years having some students from Pepperdine. I have one in my class now that I was telling Ron. She's one of my top performers, and very happy with her. So I hope more people will gravitate when you get bored of life and up in the sky here to come down to the plains to USC. So this is, I'm not quite sure how much you're going to be interested in some of what I'm going to talk about, but I'm hoping that you will at least be interested in sort of what we're doing, what we're trying to get at, and what some of the issues are. So background is that labor market issues are very prominent. They come up all the time, and they're a big challenge, it seems to me, for public policy. What kinds of labor market policies really are optimal for a given situation? And as you will see at my conclusion, I really do think that's a challenge, and I don't think there's one size fits all. So events in the news that you hear about from time to time are about the garment workers killed in Bangladesh when the building factory collapses, right? And factory workers in India infected or polluted while at work, and they get sick and die, and so on. So child labor problems around the world. There's a lot of child labor, and this means that they don't go to school. They're working in these factories or making carpets or whatever. Sexual harassment. I know I've been in countries where, while I was there and talking to some of these people in the factories, actually there came out in the newspaper about sexual harassment of female workers in these. These are all sites from different developing countries. Wage discrimination by gender, ethnicity, and religion that it really occurs kind of everywhere here, including in the United States, discussion about this. So then, of course, the public policy is, what do you do about these? These are just some examples, but what do you do about them? So in the Bangladesh case, there's a lot of pressure put to sort of maybe either prohibit exports from Bangladesh or put severe restrictions on which kind of firms you could buy from and all that kind of stuff. Cause factories to shut down when pollution is high, impose some regulations of that sort. Child labor, ban child labor, prohibit or severely limit the employment of female laborers and so on to deal with this thing, or make it very, very difficult for firms with lots of regulations to hire female workers, eliminate wage differentials and so on. But often these policies, I hope you realize that a lot of times these policy interventions that come up right after these events, they really backfire. They have some really disadvantaged effects. One about labor inspection. So I've been in country after country and looking at sort of labor regulations, and well, there's a problem, and so they put labor inspectors to come and inspect the factory more often. But then this leads to corruption. That then these labor inspectors are basically getting paid off by somebody, by these firms, so it's a very large cost, and a large cost on both ends of hiring all these labor inspectors, and then cost to the firms that are paying off the labor inspectors to get around the rules. And it's also the case that a lot of these things, like the garment workers or these issues in developing countries about unions or labor rules, the motive, the pushing force behind these is often labor unions in developed countries, which, it really is, it's motivated to protect their situation as opposed to really helping the people in those particular circumstances. And the last one I'd like to cite, because this was a paper I just heard we had yesterday at USC. We had a nice paper that I had heard a couple of times, but it was much improved this time, about banning child labor. So when India introduced a ban on child labor, what happened? The employment of children went up and the wage rates went down, which are just sort of opposite of what presumably people thought that, a ban on child labor might accomplish. Okay, so on the other hand, there are many benefits of labor regulations. I'm sure you're all aware. Regulations often come up, and this is what in principle they should be motivated by, is where there's market failure of some sort. Something that's not really working. People looking for jobs can't get the job, so what's wrong with that? Maybe we need some regulations to make it so the market's going to work more easily, and control these, put regulations that would really overcome people being polluted while working and all of these things. So overcoming market failures can be very beneficial. That's a really good justification for labor regulations. Can reduce excessive power, of course, exploitative employers and so on. It can protect from dismissal workers, and that may encourage, so you might be familiar with the sort of traditional lifelong employment relations in Japanese firms and Korean firms historically, whereby you would be working, it was a partnership between workers and managers and owners that would go on for the whole life, and that was your whole life built around this relationship, and that leads to very harmonious. I worked in Korea for a year at an institute, and we spent every weekend out with all the families of every worker and everyone in the hierarchy. That was your life, and so that kind of a framework really helps promote cooperation, obviously, among everybody. So there can be a great payoff to that, but it has also its downsides. But what I'm saying is, in contrast to some of those other cases where it kind of winds up in disaster, can be some good applications. So what I am going to present is a little bit of work with my graduate student, Yun-Sun Lee, where we've been trying to push a little bit, trying to examine the effects of deregulating labor regulations in different developing countries, so a large number of developing countries, and deregulating the labor regulations, whatever they be, and look at their effects on employment. And this is motivated by the fact that many developing countries and Southern European countries have really high unemployment rates, especially youth unemployment. And even here in the United States, your youth unemployment rates are much higher than the overall unemployment rates, and that should matter to you all, right? Because you're going to be looking for jobs. And so these high unemployment rates. And so many countries, now again, focusing on developing countries, a lot of these developing countries, they can't do what the United States and some of the big Western European countries often do, which is to have expansionary monetary policy and expansionary fiscal policy to get us out of the trough with high unemployment rates and lead us back. It's taken how many years to get out of the trough that we had 2008. But a lot of developing countries can't do this. They have balance of payments problems, they're already highly indebted, and so on. But deregulation of labor could be a way to potentially it could be a way to increase employment, lower unemployment. But on the other hand, it could have some bad consequences if you limit the regulations, if you take out the regulations on firing workers or make it easier for firms to fire workers, that could mean that there's going to be more people unemployed. Firms are going to shed workers. And it's also true that doing this and having deregulating like that might lower the benefits of this long-term relationship, and that might mean you'd have less training by firms in the workers that they regard as kind of long-term assets. So theoretical, I'm going to go very quickly now over a little bit of the background too. There are theoretical models of labor markets. There are a lot of theoretical models. Some of you may have come across this. If you've taken a labor economics or other course, you may have come across a lot of models. The complications are great. I mean, the complexities of labor markets, you have likely to have lots of situations where you have segmentation, a lot of different types of labor markets, so they're not unique, they're kind of related, but they're all a little bit different. So that means if you're really going to deal with a situation, you've got to capture all these complexities. And bear in mind, there's this, it always gives rise to asymmetries in information, which mean that one party or another might have an incentive to adverse selection to make it look like they're better than they are, and on the other hand, to practice moral hazard of not working as hard and not putting in the effort that they're supposed to be. So to deal with this, the models have to be complex. They're sufficiently complex, and those models that have been worked typically do not yield concrete solutions in terms of looking at how do we evaluate what this regulation is really do. It's going to depend on a lot of assumptions, and therefore how general the results are not very clear. So therefore, the need for empirical work on this aspect, which is where that I'm headed and want to lead you through at least a little bit about maybe how one could go through this a little bit. But on the other hand, it's not easy to do empirical work on this area. One thing is that labor regulations are typically set at the national level. So if you're in a country and you would like to look, well, let's see, can we see what happened historically when something changed? We could maybe compare, one part of the country with another part of the country, or one industry and another industry, or there might be some difference. But the labor regulations, typically set, especially in developing countries, at a national level. And therefore, you have only one set that applies to everybody in that country, and therefore you can't do these comparisons to see, well, with this set of regulations and that set of regulations. It's also true that there's relatively little variation over time. And this is something that we've looked at in the past to explain that. Why have the labor regulations in really pretty much all countries, but indeed in developing countries, why have they changed so little? And the reason is that these are very controversial politically. They're politically dangerous, so that very hard to solve. There are obvious winners and losers of kind of anything you do, and therefore they're typically not undertaken except when there's true crisis of some sort, and then something happens. So there are some studies that have been done. A lot of it has been on developed countries where the data has been a little bit better. Another complication is that when and finally you do get a change in the labor regulation, because it was so controversial, there may be lots of other things that were changed to accommodate those changes. And then finally, in dealing with labor regulations and looking at the effects, you have to distinguish between what the labor regulations say in the law, which is the de jure, and the de facto, how things work out in practice. And of course, the difference often is that enforcement is a big issue. That you may have these laws that may be one way, but if they're not enforced, the practice of these labor laws may be totally different. Okay, so there have been a number of studies on OECD countries, and I won't go through those, but some of them you may have come across that do. Some of them made nice, interesting comparisons between this Potero study, 2004, that was published in Quarterly Journal of Economics, made a comparison between New Zealand and Portugal. New Zealand had the least restrictive labor laws, and Portugal had among the most restrictive, and then they looked at what effects there were of that, and then they tried to explain what was the cause of these major differences and traced it to legal origin Portugal had French civil law system, and New Zealand had common law, British common law, like we do in the United States. So, in any case, there are a number of studies, different kinds of conclusions. In developing countries, the studies are much more recent because there hadn't been really good measures about labor regulations and rigidities on a comparable basis until about 2004, when this Botero et al. Study, again, I think it was in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, came along, and the Doing Business survey. Some of you might be familiar with these Doing Business surveys put out by the World Bank, and so this has come up, and that they sort of quantified how rigid are the labor regulations. And there's some other kinds of studies have been done, and then there have been studies then trying to use this data to look at some of the effects. Not so much on employment. So they've been looking at different things about, typically the best studies of this sort are ones that are looking at adjustments. I think that's been fairly well demonstrated, that firms are better able to adjust to changing shocks that they're faced with from export markets or domestic markets or lack of raw materials or whatever the shock is. Better able to adjust when the regulations are not too rigid. So that I think has been fairly well documented. But a lot of the other effects are I don't think are so very clear. India has received, for among developing countries, received a lot of attention because it's one exception where the states, there is a federal, national labor law, but then the states have been allowed to amend the labor law in different directions. So people have made use of that data in India across state data, and showing that there they've showed that that in the states that they've moved in a more rigid direction, that's meant that employment and other things in production and value added and everything have gone down in the formal sector, the so-called registered firms, but they've gone up in the informal sector that doesn't apply by these rules. So there's some other studies. This one very interesting one for Brazil, Almeida and Carneiro. They brought into the picture, so almost all those studies were only looking at the de facto. Here are the laws, but not looking at the enforcement to the extent that they're enforced. And yet that's an obvious issue because a lot of the countries, like a lot of Latin American countries, that Luisa is familiar with, have quite rigid labor laws, but in many cases they're just not enforced. I mean, hopeless to enforce them. So in practice, the de facto is very different than the. But in Brazil, an interesting study was done where they actually went around different localities and tried to measure the extent of enforcement, and came out with certain results. So it's that you're trying to incorporate a little bit, but not just Brazil, but going across countries in this study. So objectives of this study are to link firm perceptions of the seriousness of labor regulations as a barrier to business. So these are questions coming from something called the Enterprise Survey, that are surveys done in a whole bunch of developing and transition economies for the last maybe 10 years. And so they ask typically, every survey of every firm, these are fairly large samples of firms in each country, they ask various questions. So the first one is the question about how serious are the labor regulations a barrier to business. That's a self-identified. That's their perceptions to their firm, how serious are these labor regulations. And then second, to then link that to the following question, that everything else the same, how would your firm alter the employment level if there were no labor regulations that prevent you from hiring or firing? So in other words, if overnight all the existing labor regulations that maybe they're complaining about in A were removed, how much difference would this make for your employment, right? So it's a very unusual question, And this is what we're trying to make use of this. So studying these in enterprise surveys with those two types of question. And then also trying to come up with some measure of enforcement, since that part is also going to be an important factor, and then treat certain sort of technical problems about endogeneity and selection issues that might arise in this. And then finally to link what we talking about of the labor rigidity indexes, that these ones that have been done by Doing Business and later studies, to the perceived serious. Can we link the objective measures of how rigid are the labor laws to how the firms view those labor laws, and also at the same time to the enforcement. So that's kind of the objectives. And anyone want to ask a question already? And then I'll try to lead through, and I don't think you're going to be too interested in a lot of the details, and I'll probably run at the end to some conclusions. But anyway, that's the objective, is try to, given that we really don't have that much evidence, despite the fact that we've got a lot of different labor laws, and because they haven't changed all that much for developing countries, you don't have a lot of evidence about when you change the labor law, if you relaxed it, whatever it is, would you see a change in employment? So for these countries with the 50% youth unemployment rates, is there some hope to help solve that by way of labor deregulation, as opposed to doing something else that's probably very difficult to do? Not to say that the answer is necessarily positive. It may well be negative, but this is the issue. Okay, so we in the survey, that part A of the survey asking about obstacle to business, they ask that about kind of everything: corruption, about how easy it is to work through customs procedures, how easy it is to get a license, how easy it is to, or difficult, how serious an obstacle it is to get a government contract. But one of the questions is the labor regulations. How serious an obstacle are the labor regulations to your business? So that is scored on a 0 to 4 scale. Then out of this, now one of the aspects of it is to deal with this issue of self-selection and maybe endogeneity. What we've done is, instead of using that as an indicator that we're trying to explain the variation in, or use as an explanatory variable, that labor obstacle as reported by that firm, to make it more exogenous to that firm by constructing it for all the firms in that area, not including that firm. In other words, the other firms that are the same industry, same area, what do they say about it? This firm, for example, could be related to the prime minister, and maybe they don't have to follow the rules at all. But so getting this measure of the level in that proximity, a more exogenous and maybe better measure. Then for enforcement, we've tried several measures, but one of the ones that we find seems to be probably a better measure is the percentage of managers' time in a week spent dealing with government regulations, including labor regulations, but not exclusively labor regulations. They do ask about the labor regulations, but when they got to the details, a lot of people don't respond to the question. So we're using the one about government regulations, but if they're spending a lot of time with, even if it's tax regulation, that really means that people are seeing their factory and things like that. So it could be, the labor might well be being, even though it wasn't the main purpose, they're being observed, the labor conditions. And then so that's the main enforcement measure. Then we're looking at the other things that might be relevant to this, that firms have different characteristics. How old is the firm? How large is the firm? Its legal status, its ownership, tax rates and tax inspections, another thing we've used from the surveys, and a whole bunch of other controls. So just to give you a feel for, so we construct 5 possible measures about employment change from that hypothetical question about what would happen, what would you do about employment if all the labor regulations are taken away. So one is just a dummy for whether there's any job change. You either raise employment or you lower employment. Another one is any job creation. You create jobs. And then net job change. And then net job creation and net job destruction. So 5 different measures. Okay, so this shows you a little bit about the means. That previous one did show, a lot of firms don't say there would be a change. So it's only about half of them that say there would be a change. And then likewise here, these are about the score on obstacle explanatory variables, about how serious is labor as an obstacle on the 4-point scale. You see those aren't too high. One on a 0 to 4 scale, but most of the firms say obstacles are, in this area. So this is a little bit below the average of overall obstacles. And it, of course, varies from country to country. This is across a whole set of countries. So here's one result, just to get you a feel. This was the first simple case that we're doing a statistical analysis using this first case. It's indicating probit since the dummy variable is a 0, 1. We're using the kind of probit statistical option of explaining whether it's going to be a 1 or a 0. And any job change, as this mean obstacle labor index goes up, what does that do to any job change? And you see there is a positive and significant effect. It's also true there's a positive and significant effect on net job change. This is like a percent, that the job would be like a 2.5% increase if, or a likelihood of when this, this is absolute, so 2.5% increase of net job, this is still the 2.5% net increase, and then not job creation, that would be the increase part, and then job destruction. So notice there is some job destruction as well. So this job creation, job destruction, some firms would lay off workers, some firms would hire workers. And this is telling you that we're controlling in that particular, and you see we have about a little less than 50,000 firm observations across, I think it's about 90 countries, mostly developing countries. So the next step was, and this, you could see how this might play a role, if the firm in the last year or a few months or whatever was having a shock of some sort, they may have already adjusted their employment in some way that wouldn't be their normal. So we wanted to see how much difference that would make. So in the survey, there are questions about outages, shocks, electric power, water, telephone, transportation. Only these 2 had enough observations to really, so this was fairly common, that there would be an electricity outage and a water outage, and the time varied from this, and we took this into consideration. So we tried to see how would those things affect, how would those answers that we're getting be affected by including those things, and also including enforcement measures that hadn't looked at previously, that percentage of management time. So this is a table that's showing some results of that sort. So you see again the estimates for the same questions are significant. Now the job destruction turned around after you've made these extra controls. Now it seems that while previously it looked like there was going to be job destruction going on, now we're seeing on net there's net is negative, so there's actually less job destruction going on if at a lower level of mean obstacle labor, this perception by the firm how serious so if the higher that was, but now you remove the labor regulations. But the others remain positive and significant all the way through. And this is showing that how the enforcement variable is also playing a role. So the enforcement does make, the more it's enforced, more of these regulations are enforced, but now you remove the regulations, the more employment generation you're going to get. This was with another enforcement measure that didn't work out as well. Okay, so then these, just as an example, you might say, I mentioned about all these other controls, I'll just give you one slide that shows how these effects are different. I mean, this is just overall, different types of firms would respond to that question about how much they would lay off. So you see the older firms, like over 20 years, would be less likely to change their labor employment. Government-owned firms would be less likely to change, and so on. So this just gives you a feel for those. Okay, so then the next step was that we wanted to see maybe the effect of these removing the labor regulations would be different for different types of firms, like we were seeing that separately have different kinds of effects. So again, age group. So we looked at now, this one is showing, so up we still have in the top row is the impact of that obstacle labor issue, but now we're looking at the interaction between, let's say, obstacle labor and the particular age group. So that means that how removing, given the seriousness of the obstacle, how removing it might be different for these different size firms. And you see a little bit there, not a lot of difference. So this is what would be called heterogeneity analysis, allowing for the effects to be different across different firms. And then by firm size, the same kind of analysis. And here by firm size, we see that this large size, so there'll be much less of a positive influence, or overall positive influence. But for large size firm, you see this basically is opposite and equal to the other one, meaning it really wouldn't matter for very large firms. Okay, now I'll go quickly here to, so we also did by industry. So with different industries, the regulations have different influence. And in this case, we didn't find any differences by industry. Then I'll skip over this. So the rest of it is basically, different variants, trying to see how robust these results are to various specifications of the analysis, different estimation techniques, different ways of handling the sample that arise in this kind of context. So this was one that I only finished yesterday, which is a different approach to estimation. That it's what we'd call a two-stage approach, where you're using instrumental variables. So the key variable in all of this was that mean obstacle labor, the average of all of firm, how they said how serious the labor regulations were as an obstacle to their business for the firms in that area, but not including that firm itself. That was the key variable, so that was treated as exogenous. But this is one, let's say, what if we kind of found some instruments that would explain those responses, and use those instruments being the index of rigidity and the measure of enforcement. Use those two things as instruments to the question about how serious the labor obstacle was. So here was that original estimate of the coefficient for obstacle labor using ordinary least squares, the original kind of estimate. It was positive and significant, but very small. But when we do this, you see the numbers get much larger. So when you instrumented this variable, the impacts seem to get larger. But on the other hand, what we have to recognize, this is the average of all the obstacles. So we wanted to control for that because managers are often, the weather or something. They feel bad today and they're answering this questionnaire. They might be nasty. Everything's a problem, right? And so you try to control for that, and the way we did it was the average that they set of all the obstacles, to put it in relative terms. So therefore, it seems to me that the effect is really like the difference between these. So while that may seem awfully high, 77% increase in employment, it's really the difference between that and this 50%, or maybe about 27%. But still, it's a lot higher by this method of using the instrumental variables than the direct method. But both are consistent and that they yield positive results. Okay, so again, we did a lot of different things. We tested for the first state, whether was this legitimate? Were those strong? That first stage analysis, were the results sufficiently strong that it did point out that they were good instruments for the variable we're talking about, and then we do these tests for over-identifying restrictions, and it does hold up for, you should get about a 10 or above score. So for the overall index, we used the overall index of rigidity, and then the index of rigidity on hiring separately, the index of rigidity on firing separately. So for this one, it looks like it's satisfied. So as if it does pass the test for good IV. So then the rest is just some robustness tests about different covariates. So I talked to you about that at the end, but I think maybe in the interest of having enough time for questions, let me just hit my conclusions and go on from there. So firms hiring could increase significantly by deregulation. Okay, so those were highly significant results. The magnitudes aren't huge, but they're larger if we take this instrumented variable approach, which does seem to be justified, and to me is what we were really after from the beginning, all this work, trying to find some good instruments, because that mean obstacle labor is not exactly an exogenous variable. So the whole thing is really trying to clean up the analysis that way. The part on the effects on dismissing workers, about dismissal of workers, that would occur also, but there the results are more sensitive. We saw some, remember, that were positive, small but positive, and others that were negative. So there it's less clear about the effect on dismissal of workers overall, but the net creation, job creation, seems to be positive and quite significant. On which of the two indexes, hiring and firing, would be better to liberalize if you choose just one? The hiring one would be a little bit more powerful from the results that we found. There is tremendous diversity in the effects of labor regulations across firms, the sizes, the age of firms, industries, and so on, tax rates and other kinds of things. All these things matter. So policy implications. So since deregulation seems to drive to much more net job creation than to net job destruction, in principle, we feel that it should be somewhat easier to get agreement in countries about deregulation, at least some partial deregulation, maybe on the hiring side than it has been in the past. As I say, it was motivated by the fact there's so few times they change the labor laws, the labor regulations. Very seldom. As to which maybe on the hiring be more important than the firing. But enforcement of these regulations is really very important. So we have to take really the part on the books, unless they're enforced, it really is not going to matter. So the enforcement has to be taken into consideration, and therefore, that is very good. And how to do enforcement in a cost-effective way, I think that is very important. There are some interesting studies that have been done about which ways of enforcing may be more satisfactory and cost-effective than others. But enforcement is a major part of this. That even by itself, just enforcement had a huge effect on these answers, independent of the labor rigidity index, really. And the fourth point, one size does not fit all, as I mentioned. It seems to me, and I've worked in a number of countries where, I mean, it just seems to be, as you know, worldwide there is more of a trend towards having free zones in countries, and these free zones very special. We were talking with Ben about Middle East, so as you might know, Dubai has a very interesting thing. So this is a very high income country, although they have a lot of low-wage workers in that country, but they have a system where they have different zones for pretty much anything. There's a university zone, there's a textile zone, there's a shipping zone, there's entertainment zones, there's newspaper zones, there's all kinds of things, and they write their own rules that fit that kind of activity. I think that, and that's sort of what these free zones kind of do around the world, and I think that's a way to have one size does not fit all, to make things a little bit more. Now, given the human rights aspects of labor regulations, pregnancy leaves, child labor, excessive overtime, rights of association, safety, and all these things, by no means do I want to imply in any way that there should not be any regulations, right? These are very important things. And I would say that what we'd like to see is combining more partial labor reforms with other ways to strengthen the benefits. So that's some that work, so that some of the North European countries have made a lot of on these active labor market policies and things like that. They have these regulations where they try to make it more flexible, and so but that's kind of costly. I don't think all developing countries can do what Norway and Denmark have done. Future research. Identify particular components of these labor regulations. I've spent years coding these labor regulations and get extremely frustrated by it. There's so many clauses. Some of them seem to contradict other clauses. So coming up with a clean coding is no easy matter. But identifying which of the many clauses really matter. Even those indexes, they separate hiring, firing, and flexible work hours, that kind of thing. But those are aggregates of lots of individual things. So really more detailed analysis might help. Which are the really key things, particular clauses that are the most important. More specific focus on making the age distribution of employees, which things are going to help the youth workers better. As I said at the beginning, the labor regulations in general are ones that are against youth. The more rigid labor regulations, by making it harder to hire workers and harder to fire workers, are really going against the young people trying to, and that's you all, getting into these, getting into jobs. Make use of interactions between more of these particular types of variables to try to identify which are the different cases. Maybe we should have different rules for these different cases. So much more could go on that. So I thank you, and I do want to make an appeal. I'd just love to have some more good Pepperdine students. I have one wonderful one right now, and I've had some gems over the years, and would love to have some more. Thank you.